while I was making the Red Pill movie, I kept a video diary, which ended up tracking my evolving views. There was a common theme. I would often hear an innocent and valid point that a men's rights activist would make, but in my head, I would add on to their statement a sexist or anti-woman spin, assuming that's what they wanted to say but didn't. So here are two examples of how that would go. There are over 2,000 domestic violence shelters for women in the United States, but only one for men. Yet multiple reputable studies show that men are just as likely to be abused. I would hear them say, "We don't need 2,000 shelters for women. They're all lying about being abused. It's all a scam." They're not trying to defund women's shelters, not at all. All they're saying is that men can be abused too, and they deserve care and compassion. Second example, a men's rights activist would say to me, "Where is justice for the man who was falsely accused of raping a woman? And because of this accusation, he loses his college scholarship and is branded with the inescapable title of rapist." I would hear them say, "A woman being raped isn't a big deal." It's as if I didn't hear the word falsely accused of rape. All I heard was he was accused of rape. Of course, rape is a big deal, and all the men's rights activists I met agreed it is a horrible thing to have happened to anyone. I eventually realized what they're saying is they're trying to add to the gender equality discussion. Who is standing up for the good-hearted, honorable man that loses his scholarship, his job, or worse yet, his children, because he's accused of something he absolutely did not do?
Why don't you talk about men? It may be phrased differently, presented in faux sincerity or in accusatory tones, but anytime a woman discusses feminism, the question nonetheless arises. Anytime a woman suggests focusing on women's issues, we are instead presented with the knowledge that there are men out there who are suffering too, as if we are not allowed to mitigate the suffering of women until all men are happy first. Men's rights activists, they call themselves, positioning high suicide rates, unhappy marriages, and general depression at the feet of feminists, as if we are activism nannies, meant to care for everyone and everything in need of change, instead of focusing on our own goal of women's liberation. Quite simply, all of the so-called men's problems are either the consequence of working towards equality for women, the impact of the patriarchy, which is similar to the recoil on a gun hurting the hand that fires it, or they're not really problems at all. While some may argue that men's issues should also be addressed in discussions of feminism, it's important to understand why these issues are not the purview of women's liberation. Often, when the discussion around equal rights raises the ire of the oppressed class, someone mentions that equal rights are not pie. In other words, by allowing others to be treated with respect, dignity, and equality, it will not detrimentally affect the lives of the oppressor class. This is a form of bartering meant to prevent discontent, and yet, while it may sound like a pithy and interesting line, it is categorically untrue. In an unequal world, the oppressor class holds power over the oppressed. They have the power to oppress others, receive certain privileges and rights that others do not. Those rights come at the expense of others, and so in order for equality to occur, must be taken away. For example, when the civil rights movement occurred, it took away the right of white people to mistreat and take advantage of non-white people. Women's liberation seeks to take away the rights men have to treat women as inferior, as objects, and as property. In order to achieve equality, the oppressor class must give up some privileges and opportunities, because they rely on the oppression and suffering of another class to fulfill them. As a result, there has been a shift in the way that men have been treated, which many have been unhappy with.
Men are dying, and they're dying from this condition. And the condition they're dying from is being hated, being discriminated against. In a sense, if you look at the figures of men who lose their homes, their families, their children, and most of them, 90% of those homeless men are there as a result of domestic violence. They've been kicked out, they've been lost. We look at that, I think it's a form of genocide. I really do. I can't see anywhere in history when women have turned on men like this, men as who are the protectors, men who are out working. 75% of taxes are paid by men who are there and they are working for their wives, their children and their families. Any man who knows that there are accusations against him knows he will probably lose his job. If he has children, he has to move out of his house. This is only allegations, no evidence. Has to move out of his house, and it'll take over a year before there'll be any kind of a court case. The woman, and it's 99.9%, it's women who are making these allegations. These women get paid from the moment she makes the allegation with no evidence, can hand out up to $500,000.
One example of this can be seen in the complaint that women are monopolizing higher education, with higher enrollment in college, better performance in academia, and higher graduation rates. However, when men complain about these statistics, they seem to forget that until the mid-20th century, most higher education was banned for women, and what education was offered was often viewed as a path to marriage, hence the term MRS degree. The exclusion of women from higher education was viewed as justification for stereotypes about gender and intelligence, a theme recognized as far back as Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication for the Rights of Women, where she argued, "Men complain, with reason, about the follies and whims of our sex, except when they sharply satirize our headstrong passions and groveling vices." I would answer, behold the natural effect of ignorance. A mind that has only prejudices to rest on will always be unstable, and the current will run with destructive fury where there are no barriers to break its force. Or, in other words, women behave as is socially demanded for them to do so, not because of inborn restraints or predilections. That women have only recently illustrated intellectual prowess in higher education is not because of affirmative action, lesser standards, being treated more kindly, or because of so-called female privilege, but rather because the playing field has finally opened up to women.
Men, how do you feel if a woman does better than you at something? Are you more likely to sexualize that person? By the way, this is not some weird chest hair, just my daughter waking up from a nap. In one of the more interesting studies I came across in my PhD research, participants were asked to do some tests on a computer where they were paired up with a woman named Jessica. Except Jessica didn't exist, but they didn't know that. Half of the men were told that Jessica did better than them, the other half were told that they did better than Jessica. Here's where it gets interesting, because after they were told those results, they were then asked to select an avatar to represent Jessica. And if they were outperformed by the woman, they were more likely to select avatar here with less clothing. But it gets more complex than that, because that only happens some of the time. Generally, the men who were outperformed by Jessica had feelings of public discomfort afterwards. But only if that public discomfort then led to anger did they select avatars with less clothing. Whereas for the men who had public discomfort but it didn't lead to anger, they actually selected avatars with more clothing. So how do you interpret these results? The authors of the study believed that by selecting avatars with less clothing, it was a way for those men who felt threatened to gain back a sense of power.
That men are failing in academia is only proof of their own mediocrity and lack of academic progress. It's important to note that positions of power in academia still skew white and male. Women in higher education are still primarily learning from male faculty. Men also dominate in receiving tenure, promotions, and upwards mobility within these institutions. The same can be said of non-white professors. Although many claim affirmative action to blame for letting undereducated and underdeserved individuals into college, it should be recognized that many groups are still severely underrepresented in higher education, such as Alaskan Native and Native American individuals in higher learning, whose participation is so low that it rounds to 0%. Other claims of so-called female privilege, which stem from an attempt to equalize the sexes, centers around the publicization of the discussion of sexual assault. For generations, sexual assault, harassment, and rape have been considered to be a crime against morality rather than against the individual, meaning that the crime itself was seen as a property crime, as the woman was viewed as the property of her husband or father, and often viewed as forgivable if the rapist married her. Often, these crimes are covered up and not discussed, as to do so would reflect badly on the women harmed rather than the men who perpetrated them. However, in the past decade, the #MeToo movement has worked to publicize just how common the experience of assault is.
These are things that our exes did that we were conditioned into thinking were normal. When he held me down and pinned me on his bed and told me I couldn't go home. I got my period, and he told me I couldn't wear tampons because he didn't want them to give me pleasure.
Should I say something? I don't think I have to say anything. All I know is that if I speak, the Not All Men Brigade will be my comment section trying to prove how they are the good ones and completely disregard the point, as usual.
Many men have in turn felt threatened by the possibility of being accused of a crime they did not commit, despite all of the high-profile men accused of such crimes having had no impact on their careers or freedom. Men and women alike fearfully believe in an imaginative, vengeful woman positioning a false accusation for personal gain, in part due to the publicized trials wherein women gained the courage to speak out long after the crime was committed, and an erroneous belief that the current climate will be more forgiving and willing to listen. The nature of rape and coerced sex often makes it difficult to prove, particularly if one is of the belief that women inherently want sexual attention. However, men are more likely to be raped than accused of rape, with most crimes averaging false accusations at a rate of 2 to 8%, and the rate of false accusations of rape centering around 2 to 6%. If a woman were to make a false accusation, she would be prosecuted for wasting police time and perverting the course of justice. Most rapes aren't even reported, so it's likely the numbers for false accusations are even lower when taking those into consideration. For example, the Minnesota Law Review states, many more rapes or sexual assaults may go underreported. Some suggest only 8 to 10% of women report their rapes to the police, leaving 90% of rapes unreported. While an estimated 2 to 8% of sexual assaults or rapes are falsely reported, this number only affects the number of reported rapes. Therefore, the amount of false reports in comparison to the total number of sexual assaults and rapes is likely closer to 0.002 to 0.008%. Other problems men cite are merely the impact of the patriarchy against those who wield it. Despite claims to the otherwise, the patriarchy benefits and is supported by all men, regardless of personal belief or intent. If the result of the system in turn limits or punishes men for not conforming to the rules set by the patriarchy, that is collateral damage, as the point of patriarchal systems is to control women. One problem that supposedly disproves this notion is the breakdown of murder rates. Men are more likely to be murdered than women. However, many neglect to mention that men also commit approximately 88.7% of U.S. homicides. In other words, this is a male violence problem, not a matter of female privilege. Another common claim is that men make up the majority of dangerous professions. While this is true to an extent, it is once again due to male behavior, which punishes and pushes out women who try to work in those fields.
This commenter said, lots of tech bros whose fragile masculinity is tied solely to having to be better than women. Nailed it. Fragile masculinity necessitates that men are financially and professionally outperforming women. Fragile men view their self-worth as intertwined with their ability to be the breadwinner and provide for a family. And to, at the bare minimum, even just attract or keep a partner. Men who haven't been building emotional intelligence, who haven't learned emotional regulation, who don't know how to connect emotionally, who don't know how to build platonic friendships or even romantic relationships, are threatened by successful women because their success was their one piece of leverage, their one leverage for attracting, keeping, and providing for a partner. So as women are able to surpass men professionally in their achievements and their earned income, it shatters men's sense of self, their reality, and it undermines everything they think they deserve, whether that be partnership or a woman's body or a family. You can see this manifesting in the comment section of my posts, where men who are entirely unfamiliar with my work, who haven't worked with me on Classroom or even worked at Google, in most cases, show up to tell me that the field of work I've specialized in doesn't exist because they can't fathom the scale of engineering that occurs at a place like Google. Hence why algorithmic data engineering might not exist outside of big tech companies like Google. Or they incessantly question my achievements. They put me down by bringing up the fact that I was being gatekept at junior engineer despite a director having told me I was performing at L7, 4 levels above my work. So essentially they're rubbing it in my face, the nature of the psychological abuse I endured, which was recognized by the state of New York per my disability leave. It's why men are so angry about me commanding a $500,000 salary. I'm not even earning that yet. But the fact that I am in a position that men can no longer talk down to me because I have surpassed the skill, the ability, the achievements of so many of them makes them angry. If I wasn't someone that these men wanted to sleep with, they wouldn't feel this way, despite the fact I don't want to sleep with them.
Women often have their equipment sabotaged, are subject to sexual harassment and bullying. For example, in emergency services, female firefighters often face discriminatory practices. One interview details how a female firefighter was hired but given a 90-day probationary period. For men, it was 30. Then the gear theft and tampering started. Her gloves, hoods, and radio vanished. Her mask was sabotaged. She found what appeared to be semen on her bed. Clothes continued to be stolen and destroyed. Word of the harassment rose all the way to Mayor Don McLaury, and the department issued a warning against equipment tampering, but nothing substantively changed. A recent federal investigation into the abuse of Megan Hall illustrated the extent of grooming and abusive behaviors directed at women when joining male-dominated fields. Prostitution has a higher death rate than mining, listed as the most dangerous and male-dominated profession. Other fields which are predominantly female, such as sweatshop workers, also face high levels of danger and mortality. Other so-called problems are not really men's problems at all. For example, one of the most common arguments is that women receive custody of their children far more often during a divorce. This is because men are less likely to seek custody. Men who do seek custody tend to be abusive and tend to receive custody when they ask for it. Fathers who actively seek custody obtain either primary or joint physical custody over 70% of the time.
It's not fair for fathers. Mothers can literally say one thing and you'll never see your kid again. Let's talk about this. A gendered trap. When mothers allege child abuse by father, mothers often lose custody, study shows. This is the actual study, U.S. custody outcomes and cases involving parental alienation and abuse allegations. What does the data show? But back to this Washington Post article. This mother had alleged abuse against the father's child. He was then awarded full custody under the guise of parental alienation, and months later, their child was found dead, and he pled guilty of capital murder. This is a quote from the mother. "You wait until the child has been seriously harmed, and in my case, dead, before the evidence reaches the threshold." Here are some stats. When it came to child abuse specifically, courts were even less likely to believe mothers and children's claims, 21% of the time for child physical abuse and 19% of the time for child sexual abuse. Mothers lost custody 28% of the time, but when fathers alleged abuse, they lost custody only 12% of the time. And so what is parental alienation? Parental alienation is the accusation that one parent is undermining or damaging the relationship between the child and the other parent. Alienation is used overwhelmingly to punish mothers who accuse fathers of abuse. Mothers are often accused of leveling false abuse allegations merely to alienate the children from the father. Women are expected to behave as mothers, but then they come in and say, "I'm trying to protect my child," then they're not believed. You're just in a trap, and it's a gendered trap. Here are some stats that show that the alienation defense is being used to get mothers to lose custody battles, and how this is becoming an exponential problem. This is a quote from the conclusion. "The data supported the widespread critiques of family court proceedings, sending children into the care of destructive and dangerous parents, the gender disparity, and how much more powerfully alienation claims work for fathers as opposed to mothers." So yes, gender court is not fair, but that's not the fault of women. It is quite literally the fault of patriarchy and misogyny, and the way that masculinity has been defined as the antithesis of femininity. Traditional gender roles paint women as being nurturers who take care of the home and the child, and men as the breadwinners. And as these ideals run rampant in our society, it's not hard to see how this ideal has been put into our family court. And so yes, family court and custody battles need to be reformed in how they are decided, because there should absolutely be no gendered bias in them at all. It should be all about what is the best case scenario for the child. And so if you want to fix these problems, work towards dismantling the patriarchy and unlearning your misogyny and helping other people unlearn theirs, because misogyny hurts everyone. And in this case, it hurts fathers and mothers. It's not fair for fathers. Mothers.
Battered women are also far less likely to receive custody. In 82% of the disputed custody cases, fathers achieve sole custody despite the fact that only 13% had been involved in childcare activities prior to divorce. Moreover, 59% of fathers who won custody litigation had abused their wives, and 50% of fathers who obtained custody through private negotiations had abused their wives. If anything, there is a bias towards men in custody battles when they choose to partake in them. Another common argument is that women abuse kids more often than men. By majority, they mean 53.5%, which is an interesting number because more than 80% of child abuse is carried out by a parent. Women head the majority of families, but when men are involved, they're disproportionately likely to inflict abuse despite technically making up a smaller percentage of total abusers. In other words, households with both a man and a woman make up 69% of total parent arrangements. 23% are single mother households, while single father households make up just 4%. So despite women being present in 92% of parenting arrangements, while men are present in just 73%, men still manage to commit almost half of child abuse. Child abusers are numerically more likely to be female, but when you consider that 90% of the time child caregivers are female and only 10% of the time child caregivers are male, the likelihood of an individual female or male to abuse children is tipped in the favor of men. Men are nearly 4 times as likely to abuse children they have access to than women are. Homelessness is a rather large issue in many cities, and while single men are more likely than single women to become homeless, a large number of homeless women are invisible due to the danger of being female and without shelter. The combination of the two leads to higher cases of assault and rape, which is why many women choose instead to couch search or rely on exchanging sex for housing, which hides the total number of homeless women. One only has to look at their local Craigslist ads to realize how many men are aware of this and choose to take advantage of women in need. In terms of families, 34% of the homeless population are families, and 84% of those families are female-headed. Homeless women are far more likely to be responsible for the care of a child under the age of 18 than a man. Others argue that women perceive privilege due to being less likely to participate in combat and have less recorded deaths during war. Combat deaths exclude women because women in most countries are not allowed to be in combat. Therefore, most women who die during war are counted as civilian deaths. Women are also most likely to die after a conflict is officially over than during the conflict itself. Combat deaths comprise only 2 to 29% of total deaths related to wartime, which means that 71 to 98% of all wartime deaths happen after the conflict is officially over, typically caused by things like infectious disease and traffic accidents due to the damage to infrastructure that inevitably follows a war. These deaths are primarily seen in women and children. In a study by Plumper and Neumeier, armed conflict was demonstrated to have a statistically significant and adverse effect on women, as measured by the decline in the ratio of female to male life expectancy. In other words, normally women live longer than men in almost all societies. So a decrease in the gender gap is interpreted as suggesting that the direct and indirect consequences of conflict combined either kill more women or that the killed women are younger on average than the men killed. The authors therefore concluded that wars negatively affected women more than men when taking into account the entire conflict cycle. While more men than women die in combat, this is also because in the vast majority of combat zones, even in recent history, women were specifically barred from being considered active combatants, making them more likely to be counted among civilian casualties than military casualties, which comprise approximately 90% of all wartime deaths.
First thing I'm going to show you is how FGM type 1 happens. Yeah? So, that's clitoris and that's the clitoris hook. Pricking like that, and then blood has to flow through. In certain communities, type 1 usually means cutting this off. A lot of women who've gone through FGM don't feel pleasure because of what has happened, because that part of their body was traumatized, basically. Now I'm going to show you how type 3 is performed. All of this has to be cut away. See? All of it. All of it. This is the small labia I'm cutting away now, yeah? Next. The large labia is also removed.
No. What?
Yep. So this is a needle on a thread. Then you start sewing that through. So basically all of this will be closed to a point. Can you see that small hole?
That's torture, isn't it?
I feel like you guys are in shock or something. I'll show them images of FGM taking place and its effects.
That's babies, aren't they?
Those are babies.
Yes. That's...
Men often compare circumcision to female genital mutilation. This is especially tone deaf, as when male circumcision is a largely unconsented genital surgery that carries potential health risks, it does not leave lifelong health complications or prevent sexual pleasure. Female genital mutilation has a long list of acute and long-term complications, such as difficulty urinating, dysmenorrhea, and also accumulation of blood in the vagina. When it comes to labor, these women have to receive a surgical reopening of the scar in order for the baby to be delivered safely. It has also been shown that women commonly avoid normal gynecological screenings such as smear tests and STI screening due to the difficulties associated with vaginal examinations. In most cultures, the legs of the victims are bound together after the procedure, and there are cases where some girls have broken their limbs due to being restrained during the procedure. Children who've been brought back from quote-unquote holidays having been mutilated don't feel able to communicate about their experiences, and often suffer from not only psychological complications, but also recurrent urinary tract infections and dysmenorrhea, consequently often missing a number of dates in education. In contrast, circumcision can improve a male's sex life, as although circumcision makes the penis a bit less sensitive to touch, it has no negative impact on sex life. The removal of foreskin increases the time of ejaculation, thus making the male last longer during sexual intercourse. Other benefits include lowered risk of penile cancer, HIV transmission, and other STIs, decreased risk of UTIs, and easier hygiene. Another commonly cited statistic is that men commit suicide more often than women.
To all you men out there, let me ask you this question. If you feel like you're around people that you can't show emotions, you can't show your feelings, you can't show that you've got the biggest heart, is it those people? Because if they make you feel that way, I don't care who they are, they're not your people. On the flip side, if this is something that you believe, that you're holding yourself back from, know that it's okay. Reach out to somebody, talk to somebody. And for anybody that says, no, there's nobody I can talk to, yes, there is. There always is. Because I guarantee you, somebody would rather talk to you face to face than say goodbye in a box.
This is true, but it is often left out that women attempt suicide more often than men, but often choose less violent options. Men tend to use guns and tend to be successful, whereas women do not. They also commit murder-suicides far more often. Meanwhile, women have higher mental illness rates, which tend to be highly sexualized and used to control and take access of vulnerable women. Another erroneous claim is that men face sexual violence as much as women do, but do not report it out of shame. This implies that women do not feel shame at being assaulted, and that claims of assault are treated with more kindness for women when this is simply not true. Female victims are expected to be assaulted and treated as if it's an everyday occurrence, while male victims are treated far more nicely by the police system. Let's be clear. Men are far more likely to rape than to be raped. The majority of sexual assault victims are female, and the majority of perpetrators are male. Nearly 1 in 5 American women have been raped. The comparable number for men is 1 in 71. Not only that, but more than half of female victims reported their rapist was an intimate partner, a current or former spouse or boyfriend, or a date. According to a 2000 study by the Department of Justice, female rape victims were also about twice as likely as male rape victims to be injured during an assault, even though many women do not physically resist their attackers for fear of injury.
Okay, as a woman today in America, what rights do you not have that men have?
Okay, so I looked at the comments of this video because I was honestly curious what rights women think they don't have. And it's literally not even rights that we don't have. They're like being able to walk alone at night, being able to go to the store without looking over my shoulder. You still have the right to go to the store. You still have the right to walk alone at night. You're not going to get arrested and charged with any crime for walking alone at night. And then they turn around and they're like, well, men, nothing. You're just scared for no reason. I've walked to my 24-hour grocery store in the middle of the night multiple times from my house, which is approximately 1.5 miles away. Because I'd get the munchies and I'd be like, man, I want some true-frou. So I go walk to the store. These rights you don't have are not rights you don't have. You are letting fear control every portion of your life. It's pathetic and you are weak.
Men's rights activism is nothing more than a response to feminism, an example of the backlash received during every wave of women's liberation, no matter how small the gains may be. Viewing the world through a lens of male dominance blinds you from the fact that the ideology exists at all because it's so omnipresent. In turn, this leads to viewing any equalization as being a personal attack. It is not. It is an attack on male dominance, a dominance which has existed due to the forced subjugation of half of the planet. In Gaelic Radical Revolution, De Barra writes, "The reason that dominant ideologies are successful is precisely because of their ability to deny their ideologies at all. Instead, the supporters of the dominant ideology maintain that their position is based on the plainest common sense, on the use of reason, logic, and rationality. They deny that there are any ideological influences on their worldview, while insisting that their opponents have been brainwashed by their ideology and can't think for themselves. Everyone accepts that socialism is an ideology, but in the Western world we are a bit slower to see capitalism as one as well. Instead, we depict capitalism as just how the world works, or as the social model that just is economic common sense. Similarly, no one has any problem labeling feminism as an ideology, but many people would deny that there is any such thing as an ideology that opposes feminism. Quite simply, feminism is a lens that centers women in a world in which men typically are the norm. It is only a political statement because one refuses to recognize that the patriarchy is a political statement as well. So when I am asked, what about men? The answer is, what about them? You can go practically anywhere else to find support for male dominance, but you will not find sympathy or focus for problems that are at best overstated, and worse, made up completely in my feminism. This, dear viewers, is where we part. This was inspired by a comment that someone left on a previous video, which really just, it caught me. Like, wow, what about men? Why aren't you talking about men? Have you looked at my channel? I haven't done this since back when I was reviewing cartoons, but if you make it all the way to the end of this video and you type in, you are the first person to type in the code word, you will get sent a postcard in the mail if you're willing to share with me your address. So this episode's password is St. Patrick's Day. It's a very simple one, but let's see if anyone makes it this far down. If you have any suggestions for further videos, comments, questions, concerns, especially when they're social media related things. I don't spend a lot of time on social media besides like scrolling through Tumblr idly, so I miss out on a lot of the trends. If you have any of that stuff you think is interesting, feel free to send my way and I'll discuss it. And